The moment I realized my own name had become evidence against me, I understood that my life had already been altered in ways I could not undo, because there is nothing more destabilizing than being accused by your own identity. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, slipped between harmless envelopes and advertisements, looking so ordinary that I almost opened it without attention, never imagining that within a few lines of printed text, everything I believed about safety, family, and trust would collapse at once. My name, Elena Whitmore, appeared in bold at the top of the page, repeated again and again beneath legal language that did not ask questions or request clarification, but stated conclusions, timelines, and consequences as if the story had already been told without me present. According to the document, I had committed fraud, not suspected, not investigated. Committed. Accounts had been opened, loans had been approved, funds had been transferred, and all of it carried my signature, my personal information, and my credibility. I remember sitting at my kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, the room painfully quiet, rereading the letter slowly, because denial feels safer than understanding when reality threatens to collapse. And part of me wanted desperately to believe this was an administrative error that could be resolved with a phone call. But mistakes leave room for doubt. This did not. This was precise, organized, and disturbingly confident. I called the number listed on the notice, with a calm I had to force into my voice, and the conversation that followed confirmed my fear rather than easing it, because the person on the other end spoke to me with professional neutrality reserved for people already flagged. They referenced dates, transactions, and applications with accuracy that made my stomach tighten. And when I insisted that none of it was mine, there was a pause before they explained that the documentation used had been strong enough to pass verification. Strong documentation. That phrase echoed long after the call ended, because strong documentation does not come from strangers guessing. It comes from someone who knows you, someone who knows where you lived, someone who knows your habits, someone who knows your past. That night, sleep did not come easily, because as I reviewed every record provided, something far more unsettling began to emerge, something that turned fear into recognition. The addresses tied to the fraudulent accounts were familiar, not places I had lived, but places I had visited often, places tied to family gatherings, places connected to one person who had always hovered between charm and chaos in my life. My brother, Nathan Whitmore. Nathan had always lived differently from me, not irresponsibly in obvious ways, but recklessly enough that consequences followed quietly behind him, often absorbed by others before they reached him fully. Growing up, he was praised for ambition, while excused for failure, while I was praised for reliability and expected to maintain stability no matter the cost. Because families often confuse responsibility with obligation. Our parents, Margaret Whitmore and Daniel Whitmore, framed this dynamic as balance, insisting that siblings compensate for one another, never acknowledging that compensation often means sacrifice for one and freedom for the other. Nathan had learned early that charm softened judgment, that confidence blurred accountability, and that family loyalty could be weaponized when needed. And over time, those lessons shaped him into someone who expected rescue rather than consequence. As I traced timelines, the connections became impossible to ignore, because the fraudulent activity aligned perfectly with periods when Nathan was struggling financially, drifting between business ideas, or asking subtle questions about credit, loans, and systems he claimed to be curious about. He had visited me during some of those times. He had borrowed devices. He had access to shared family documents. And most disturbingly, he had access to information I had never shared publicly. Answers to security questions tied to childhood memories only family would know. This was not identity theft by chance. This was identity theft by proximity, by blood. When I approached my parents, I did so carefully, not accusing but asking, because I needed to see whether truth would be met with concern or deflection. And their responses told me everything. My mother dismissed the idea immediately, insisting no one in our family would ever do such a thing, framing loyalty as proof rather than evidence, while my father urged patience, cautioning me against assumptions that could damage relationships permanently. Neither of them asked to see the documents. Neither of them expressed urgency. That silence confirmed what I had begun to understand. If Nathan had done this, they were already prepared to protect him. That realization hurt more than the fraud itself, because it revealed that the damage to my life was considered manageable compared to the damage to family image. I began documenting everything meticulously, not emotionally, because emotion clouds strategy, and strategy was now essential. I requested full credit reports. I logged every inconsistency. I traced every address, signature, and date until a clear narrative emerged, one that revealed planning rather than impulse. As I worked, I watched Nathan closely, noticing how casually he spoke about money, how he avoided specifics, and how his confidence never wavered. Because confidence like that is built on expectation, the expectation that someone else will absorb the consequences. He believed I would fix this quietly. He believed I would protect him. He believed I would protect the family. What he did not understand was that, by committing fraud in my name, he had crossed a line that could not be negotiated privately, because identity, once violated, demands restoration through accountability, not silence. I did not confront him immediately, not because I was uncertain, but because confrontation without leverage only gives liars time to prepare defenses. This time my name had been weaponized, and I would not allow the person who destroyed my financial identity to hide behind shared blood or parental excuses. The evidence already existed. The truth was already written. All that remained was deciding how public the consequences would be. And once that decision was made, there would be no way for my brother to escape what he had done while wearing my name. Once the reality settled that my name had been turned into a weapon against me, I stopped looking at my family as a source of comfort and started seeing them as part of the environment in which this crime had been allowed to grow, because fraud does not survive on documents alone. It survives on silence, access, and people who look away when looking closer would be inconvenient. The days after the letter arrived passed in a strange emotional stillness, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was happening beneath the surface, quietly reorganizing my priorities, my expectations, and my understanding of loyalty, especially the kind that demands sacrifice from one person to protect another from consequences. I continued going to work, maintaining routine, smiling in meetings, and responding to emails as if my financial identity were not unraveling behind the scenes, because visibility mattered now, and panic would only weaken my credibility in places where trust had to be preserved at all costs. At night, however, my focus sharpened into something deliberate and methodical, because fear without action becomes paralysis, and paralysis was not an option when my reputation, career, and legal standing were at risk. I began by contacting credit bureaus formally, filing disputes supported by detailed documentation, and placing fraud alerts on every account associated with my identity, and while these steps were necessary, they also revealed the full scale of what had been done in my name. This was not one impulsive mistake. This was a network of calculated decisions. Multiple accounts had been opened across different institutions. Applications had been staggered strategically to avoid immediate detection. Repayment schedules were manipulated just enough to delay suspicion. Someone had studied the system carefully. Someone had planned this. As I reviewed transaction histories, something deeply unsettling became clear. Because many of the purchases and transfers aligned with investments Nathan had mentioned casually over the past year. Ideas he floated without details, always speaking in possibilities rather than commitments. At the time, I had assumed he was exaggerating ambition the way he always did. Now, I understood that ambition had been funded by me without my consent. I met with a financial advisor recommended by a colleague, someone experienced in identity fraud cases, and the moment I laid out the evidence, their reaction confirmed what I already suspected but had not fully accepted. This was criminal, and the longer it went unaddressed legally, the more complicated my recovery would become. They explained patiently that when fraud involves family, victims often hesitate, delay, or attempt private resolution, and that hesitation frequently benefits the perpetrator rather than the victim. Because systems respond to action, not emotional context. That sentence stayed with me. Systems respond to action, not to family dynamics, not to guilt, not to pressure. Action. The weight of that truth settled heavily, because taking action would mean crossing a line my family had always avoided, the line where reputation gives way to accountability, and silence no longer functions as protection. I decided then that I would not confront Nathan privately until I understood the full extent of the damage, because confrontation without preparation invites manipulation, and Nathan was skilled at redirecting blame when he felt cornered. Instead, I watched him. I paid attention to the way he spoke around me now, how his confidence had increased rather than diminished, how he joked more freely about money, about risk, about systems being flawed enough to exploit. He did not suspect me. He assumed normalcy. That assumption gave me leverage. Family gatherings became exercises in restraint, because sitting across from someone who had quietly endangered your life while smiling required discipline I had never needed before. Nathan spoke animatedly at dinners, telling stories that painted himself as underestimated and misunderstood, while my parents nodded along supportively, reinforcing the narrative that he was merely navigating temporary setbacks. I listened carefully, noting how often my parents redirected attention when conversations drifted towards specifics, and I realized they were managing him the same way they always had, not by correcting behavior, but by cushioning consequences. The difference now was that I was no longer willing to be the cushion. As I dug deeper, I uncovered something that shifted my understanding from betrayal to calculation, because one of the fraudulent accounts had been used to secure a short-term business lease, and the signature matched not just my name, but my professional title, copied directly from my work profiles. That level of detail required observation. Access.intent. I contacted the leasing company anonymously, posing general questions about verification processes, and learned that Nathan had presented himself confidently, supported by documentation that appeared legitimate. Because legitimacy, when forged carefully, relies on consistency rather than authenticity. Someone had coached him. Someone had enabled him. The possibility that my parents knew more than they admitted became harder to ignore, not because I believed they orchestrated the fraud, but because they had created an environment where Nathan felt entitled to resources that were not his, including my identity. The emotional strain intensified as legal correspondence increased, because institutions do not wait for families to resolve internal conflict, and every letter carried consequences that could reach my employer if left unaddressed. I informed my manager discreetly, explaining that my identity had been compromised and that documentation would follow, and while they responded professionally, I could sense the shift because trust, once questioned, never feels exactly the same. That realization fueled my resolve because Nathan had not just stolen money, he had endangered my credibility. And credibility, once damaged, is not easily repaired. I finally confronted my parents more directly, presenting evidence without accusation, and their reactions confirmed the dynamic I had feared because my mother's first response was emotional distress rather than concern for my situation, and my father's focus remained on preserving family unity rather than addressing the crime itself. They urged patience. They urged discretion. They urged me to consider how public exposure would affect everyone. No one urged accountability. That was the moment I understood something essential. If I did not act decisively, they would protect Nathan indefinitely, because protecting him had become part of their identity as parents, even if it meant sacrificing mine as a daughter. I stopped seeking their validation then. I stopped explaining. I shifted fully into action. I retained legal counsel experienced in financial fraud cases, someone who did not know my family, and therefore owed them nothing. And together we reviewed the evidence, building a case that did not rely on, and while the consequences were severe, not disappear quietly. The decision was no longer abstract. That followed, noticing subtle changes in his behavior, as if he sensed the environment shifting, even if he could not identify why. He tested reactions. He attempted reassurance. Those behaviors told me he suspected risk would not be silent, subtle. It would be public. It would be documented. It would be undeniable. Who had protected him to confront the consequences of their silence? I was no longer interested in restoring peace. And once truth entered the room openly, from what he had done using my name, after the night I decided that silence, I began moving through my life with a level of awareness I had never needed before, because once betrayal comes from inside your own bloodline, you learn quickly that danger does not always announce itself loudly. I stopped reacting emotionally and started observing patterns, because patterns reveal intention far more reliably than explanations. And Nathan's behavior, once viewed without the filter of sibling loyalty, exposed a man who had grown comfortable operating without consequences. He continued speaking casually about money, about business ideas that always seemed just one step away from success, and about opportunities he framed as temporary setbacks whenever they failed, all while carrying the quiet confidence of someone who believed he was protected by more than luck. That confidence came from history. It came from years of watching our parents smooth over his mistakes, minimize his failures, and reframe his irresponsibility as misunderstood potential. And I understood now that this fraud was not an isolated act, but the most extreme expression of a pattern that had been reinforced repeatedly. While Nathan performed normalcy, I built infrastructure, because revenge without structure collapses under scrutiny, and I needed what I was about to do to survive legal, social, and emotional examination. I retained a second legal consultant, under the recommendation of my advisor, someone who specialized specifically in family-linked financial crimes. And the moment I laid out the evidence, their reaction confirmed something important. This case would not stay quiet even if I wanted it to. The scale, the planning, and the misuse of professional identity ensured that institutions would respond aggressively once formally notified, because fraud committed through impersonation damages systems. That reality shifted my thinking. Exposure was inevitable. The only remaining question was whether I would control the narrative or allow it to unfold without context, leaving my parents to rewrite events in his favor. I chose control. I began assembling documentation into layers, not just financial records, but timelines, witness patterns, and contextual evidence that demonstrated intent rather than desperation, because desperation invites sympathy, while intent demands accountability. I contacted former colleagues of Nathan discreetly, people he had mentioned in passing, and what emerged was a consistent story of unfinished projects, unpaid obligations, and abrupt exits, framed as opportunity elsewhere. No one described him as malicious. They described him as slippery. That distinction mattered. Slippery people survive because they avoid being pinned down. I was building the pin. At home, my parents grew increasingly uneasy, not because they knew the truth, but because they sensed a shift in me they could not manage. My mother attempted emotional closeness, offering unsolicited help and affection. That felt less like care and more like containment, while my father emphasized patience, warning subtly about how easily families fracture when conflict is handled publicly. Their fear was not about justice. It was about visibility. They were afraid of being seen. I watched them carefully during this time, noticing how often conversations were redirected away from accountability and toward unity, how often responsibility was framed as cruelty, and how rarely my situation was acknowledged directly. That avoidance became part of the evidence. I documented privately, not for legal purposes, but for clarity, because clarity prevents doubt later when pressure intensifies. Nathan eventually sensed change. He began asking indirect questions, testing boundaries, probing for reassurance without requesting it outright. Because manipulators rarely ask directly when they fear the answer. He mentioned stress casually. He hinted at misunderstandings. He framed himself as overwhelmed. Those signals confirmed that his confidence was eroding. But erosion was not collapse. Collapse requires impact. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly, through a routine notification from one of the financial institutions involved, informing me that a formal review committee would soon require in-person verification, because inconsistencies had reached a threshold that could not be resolved digitally. That was the opening. Verification meant presence. Presence meant exposure. I coordinated with my legal counsel and allowed the process to proceed, knowing full well that Nathan would attempt to intervene once he realized the scrutiny was escalating, because people who commit fraud panic not when discovered, but when control is removed. Sure enough, days later he reached out, not to confess, not to explain, but to test. He spoke casually, asking whether I had received strange mail recently, whether I had noticed anything unusual with my accounts, and whether everything felt normal. The irony of that word settled heavily. Normal. I responded neutrally, giving nothing away, because neutrality unsettles people who rely on emotional reactions to guide their next move. His tone shifted subtly then, from curiosity to reassurance, as he spoke about how complicated systems can be, how mistakes happen, and how family always supports one another through confusion. That was his mistake. Because reassurance offered prematurely reveals guilt. I documented the interaction carefully, noting phrasing, timing, and context, because even indirect communication can demonstrate awareness when aligned with other evidence. The trap was closing, and for the first time Nathan felt it. I finalized my decision that night. This would not end with private confrontation or negotiated repayment. This would end with formal exposure, legal accountability, and reputational collapse. Not as revenge for emotional harm, but as consequence for criminal behavior. I informed my parents the next morning that legal proceedings were imminent, without specifying names, and their reaction confirmed everything I needed to know. Fear surfaced immediately. Not concern for me. Fear of scandal. Fear of judgment. Fear of questions they could not answer. My mother asked if there was any way to stop it. My father asked whether this could be handled quietly. Neither asked whether the crime should be punished. That silence was my final permission. By the end of that week, formal complaints were filed, verification appointments scheduled, and investigative processes initiated that could not be reversed by family pressure or emotional appeals. Nathan still believed he had time. He believed charm could intervene. He believed blood outweighed documentation. He was wrong. Because when systems designed to track truth begin moving, they do not stop for family dynamics. And when the truth is supported by records, witnesses, and patterns, denial becomes irrelevant. The collapse had begun. He just did not realize yet that the ground beneath him was already gone. The day everything collapsed did not arrive with chaos or shouting, because real destruction rarely announces itself loudly, and instead it entered quietly through official emails, scheduled meetings, and signatures that could no longer be undone. The verification appointment took place in a downtown office building that smelled of polished floors and quiet authority, a place where emotions carry no weight and facts speak without interruption. And I arrived early, fully prepared, because preparation is the difference between revenge driven by anger and revenge carried out with precision. Nathan arrived late. That alone told me everything. He walked in with the same practiced confidence he had used his entire life, dressed well, smiling lightly, and behaving as though charm could still bend reality in his favor, because people who survive on manipulation often mistake routine tolerance for immunity. I watched him from across the room, noticing how his posture shifted the moment. Folders arranged neatly. Posture calm, expression unreadable. Victim seeking clarity. The meeting progressed methodically, with officials explaining discrepancies, timelines, and procedural findings. And as documents were placed on the table, Nathan's body reacted before his voice ever did. Because denial collapses first in the physical form. His breathing changed. His hands tightened. His gaze avoided mine. The evidence spoke clearly, outlining how my identity had been used repeatedly, strategically, and knowingly, not once, not accidentally, and not under confusion, but through deliberate action that required planning and awareness. When they asked him to explain, his responses fragmented. He shifted blame toward system errors. He suggested misunderstandings. He referenced family arrangements that never existed. Each explanation collapsed under documentation that showed his authorization attempts, his device signatures, his access patterns, and his communications. There was no ambiguity left to exploit. What followed was not an argument. It was a conclusion. The officials informed him that formal fraud charges would proceed, that financial accounts would be frozen, pending investigation, and that restitution processes would begin immediately, all while legal authorities were notified to pursue criminal charges. Nathan did not look at me when the words were spoken. He stared at the table, because for the first time in his life, no one was stepping in to save him. What shocked him most was not the legal collapse. It was the realization that I had allowed it to happen openly, that I had not warned him, that I had not negotiated, that I had not softened the landing. I stood once the meeting concluded, thanked the officials, and walked out without confrontation, because confrontation was no longer necessary when consequences were already in motion. But the confrontation came later, at home, publicly. My parents learned the truth not through whispers or softened versions, but through official notifications, frozen assets, and calls they could not avoid. And when they finally demanded explanations, the story unraveled quickly. Because lies lose power once institutions intervene. Nathan attempted to portray himself as overwhelmed, pressured, and misunderstood. He framed his actions as temporary solutions. He claimed intention to repay. None of it mattered, because intent does not erase impact. The family meeting that followed was not emotional. It was surgical. I presented timelines. I presented records. I presented outcomes. And then I said the only thing that needed to be said. I told them that their protection of him had ended my silence, that their refusal to hold him accountable had forced me to seek justice elsewhere, and that their desire for appearances had cost them their relationship with me. There was no shouting, no dramatic exchange, just clarity settling heavily into the room. Nathan lost more than money. He lost credibility. He lost professional standing. He lost relationships that had been built on assumed integrity. Word spread quickly, not because I fueled it, but because financial crimes create ripple effects that reach employers, partners, and social circles automatically. Invitations stopped. Opportunities vanished. His name became associated with risk. That is a punishment no apology can repair. I made my final decision quietly. I packed my belongings. I secured my accounts. I closed the chapter of my life that had been built on forced loyalty and selective blindness. Before leaving, I told my parents that love without accountability is not love, that family without honesty is only a title, and that I refused to sacrifice my future to preserve their comfort. I did not wait for permission. I did not wait for understanding. I left. The revenge was complete not because Nathan suffered, but because I reclaimed control over my identity, my integrity, and my future, and because the truth was no longer hidden, minimized, or excused. Justice did not arrive dramatically. It arrived decisively. And sometimes the strongest revenge is not destroying someone loudly, but forcing them to live openly with the consequences of who they chose to be. When family betrays you and hides behind blood to escape accountability, choosing truth over silence is not cruelty, it is survival. If someone used your name to destroy your future, would you protect the family's image, or would you protect yourself? No matter who fell with the truth,